videos that we saw yesterday. They said they made a small error, that they wanted to reintroduce him as a whole instead of little bits. Not sure about all of that. We start watching the video, and this is Flynn's video where he's recording. Now Flynn has deceased, and he's not there to be cross-examined, and he is narrating this video. So throughout the video, you hear Flynn say some things. He says, deadly force. They said they're gonna use deadly force. Then he says, get the kids out of there. Get the children out of there. Another person next to him says, that's not going to happen. And then a little bit later, he says, don't do this. God, oh my God. And so this is pretty, this is what the jury is hearing as they're watching evidence. What this gentleman is saying is not evidence. It's his own narration on this. He is a reporter, and he has an agenda. We also had Alex identify Ammon Bundy. Basically, the Bundys are going back on trial.
Yeah, the Bundys were on trial again for probably the first half. We're at an intermission here, just a quick break before we go back for the segment before lunch. The Bundys went back on trial this morning. 3 or 4 videos there where Ammon and Cliven and Ryan Bundy were all identified by the witness. We then went into a short video clip. It's a video clip of Eric Parker on a bridge giving a statement to Michael Flynn. We were a little bit concerned about that because, if we're honest, Eric's a little bit legally exposed on this issue. They're going to have to bring this up in closing arguments and when they present their case. It could have gone a lot worse than it did. It was a very short video clip in the middle of the continued prosecution of the Bundys, so we felt pretty good about that.
Alex then does point out Eric in the courtroom and that he knows him from that. The video is on YouTube, and it's not something new that we did not know about. At this point in the video, one of the points he says he's not with Flynn anymore, but he could see where Flynn is. Flynn goes back down in the wash. He's not with him, but he can see where he's at from the bridge. All of the defendants object to this because he can't say that it's from the same perspective, but the judge allows it. In that part of the video, Ammon says that the BLM wanted 5 days to get out, and they were not going to agree to those terms. He's talking about the meeting that they have when they go over the gate and talk with Tom Roberts and the BLM. He says, we did not accept these terms, so the BLM said they would take 30 to 40 minutes to leave, and was telling the crowd to back up, and give them time to leave.
The continued issue with Ellis's testimony here is that he was not at the same vantage point that Michael Flynn for most of these videos. At some points he was 100 or more yards away, and defense attorneys are arguing he didn't make this video, he wasn't there, and the judge is saying, well, his vantage point goes to the weight of the evidence, not to the authenticity. So they're allowing someone who didn't make the video, who wasn't standing in the same place, to essentially say, well, from that wide angle of view, from the northbound bridge, which is where he stood most of the time, Mr. Flynn's footage, some of it happens down in the wash, as we discussed before, post number 2 at the gate, 100 yards at least. They're allowing this video evidence as if Ellis was there. They're saying it just goes to the weight of the evidence, not to the authenticity. So defense attorneys have objected to every single piece of evidence, and every one of them has been overruled, and these videos are continually admitted into evidence.
Then we go into the cross-examination. Tomasi started, that's Stephen Stewart's lawyer. He starts with, you met Flynn at a protest in 2013. It was a protest about government shutdown, possibly about the
there's the debt
funding.
Debt ceiling issue. He apparently organized a protest up in St. George, Utah that had to do with a debt ceiling issue. So they were trying to make the point that maybe he went to the Bundy Ranch for a different purpose than Mike Flynn. Maybe, and the next logical conclusion was maybe these defendants went to the Bundy Ranch for some other issue besides, Cliven Bundy's cattle. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Wasn't sure.
As soon as he says that he organized that protest, Stephen Myrie objected. Relevance, it was allowed. The very next question was, did you know why my client was at the protest? There was an objection that was not, it was sustained, so do you believe some of the guys carrying guns believed it was their right to? There was an objection. Alex said that Cliven had told them to.
That was a key issue. We haven't seen that in evidence yet. I've never seen that in any of the evidence that's been presented. This gentleman said, the question was, do you believe that they were there carrying weapons because that was their right? And he said, well, that and Cliven told them to carry guns. I've never heard of Cliven say that. I've never seen that. You scoured the bowels of the internet looking for videos on this issue. I have never heard Cliven Bundy say, take your guns and go get my cattle. There were no objections to that. I think all of us were pretty shocked. There were no objections to that testimony.
There was objection because he didn't even get to finish what he said about Cliven, and there was an objection.
There were also objections right after that. There is something in an FBI report that this young man gave. He was interviewed by the FBI in 2015. There is something in that report that creates an impeachable situation in his current testimony. There is something that he has said that has contradicted what he has said in sworn testimony on the stand. And Stephen Tanasi for Stephen Stewart, he cannot get to that piece of evidence. As many times as he tried, in as many ways as he tried, U.S. attorneys objected to everyone, and they were able to keep him from being able to introduce this sworn statement that he gave to the FBI. There's something in there, we don't know what it is.
Then he went back to say, you were up on the bridge, and then you went down into the wash with Mr. Flynn. And he said yes, and then he said, okay, at that point your back was to the bridge. And that's when he finished his questioning, and then we went to Todd Engel. Had Mr. Ellis talk about protesters, because as we know, they're not calling this a protest. So he had him talk about protesting quite a bit, calling them protesters. He said after he took us to a clip and played the clip, and he said, after you heard that lady, did you hear that lady, what she said? And she said, what is it that she said? That's not the BLM. They're not supposed to be down here. And then he was asked if that was true, and he said, no, that's not true. What the sheriff had said was that he needed to talk to Cliven on the stage afterwards. He didn't say the BLM was leaving. He said he needed to have a conversation with Cliven. So basically, what we have here is this witness has been practicing for this with the prosecution for some time, because, you know, once again, that truck picture was brought up, the park rangers with the weapons. Alex says multiple times, yes, he did see weapons trained on the protesters, but he didn't see that truck. They show pictures. Todd brings up the pictures. Here's the truck. Do you recognize the truck from this picture? He says, no, I never saw that truck. So every witness that has come in has declined from seeing this truck. I mean, one of the witnesses was 30 yards from the truck.
This is the phantom truck of the Bundy Ranch protest. It absolutely is. Two federal agents do not remember seeing this vehicle with agents with their weapons pointed at protesters. One agent was less than 30 feet away from it. He has no recollection of seeing that truck. And this person who stood on the northbound bridge and was able to see his, his fellow reporter all the way down the wash, he wasn't somehow able to see this vehicle with weapons pointed at protesters.
But yeah, we saw this truck on the leaked video, so.
We have seen this. There's pictures of this. We'll try to put it in the comments. It's a blue Chevy pickup. It's got 4 doors, and it's surrounded by agents, and they're pointing weapons at people. Todd Engel is, by the way, he is still the rock star of pro se representation. Today, he got this witness not only to admit that the BLM was authorized to use lethal force. Todd Engel asked him specifically, did the BLM say they were going to use lethal force? That they were going to do it, and the witness said that is correct. And I think that's huge, because up until now, people have said they were authorized to use lethal force. This witness is saying that the BLM said they were going to use lethal force. And I think that's going to help us out.
Right before we left, the last thing that was brought in, and I believe we're at Todd Leventhal now.
Correct.
He brought up a article that Alex did. What was the article called?
United Police States of America.
And in that article, he says something other than what he said. He said a contradicting statement that completely today on the testifying.
Yeah, it was in regards to Carol Bundy and standing in front of a vehicle.
That was actually Margaret Houston.
Margaret Houston, not Carol Bundy.
He doesn't know who she is.
Who she is. And they have his article that he wrote, and it's about to be admitted in, or it's about to be shown to him so that he can remember what his comments in that article was. But the government immediately was like, well, we want to see it first. And so they showed it to them and let us out for break. So we're going to go back inside and see if this piece of evidence is going to be allowed in.
Sweet.
Awesome,
Thank you.
thanks, Andrea. Thanks.
After we came back from lunch, we were cross-examining Agent, what was his name?
Stover.
Stover?
Rand Stover.
Rand Stover. And the first thing they were asked was political pressure part of the reason that you did not complete the contracts with the cattle house to sell the cattle and with the contract cowboys, and that was a yes. They brought in a lot more information with the Dave Bundy video. They identified Jason Cox as the person talking to Ryan Bundy in the video, that there was no... Ryan didn't have any firearms in the van. He complied and he was not arrested. Also, Dave did not have any firearms and he was arrested with an iPad. And asked if there was other evidence from Dave Bundy, and he said 3 phones, an ID, an iPad, and a folder. And then they talked about a meeting when he then gave that property back. They started to talk about what situation you would arrest a person and then keep the property that they were arrested with instead of actually giving that property to the arresting authority. And that was objected to, and we never got the answer.
Because the BLM agents were the ones that actually had all of his property.
Right,
Absolutely.
that agent that's a witness in there. And they did show the snipers on the hill when they were arresting Dave Bundy and asked who they were under, and at one point they were under this witness.
They talked about the meeting on the morning of April 9th when Dave got his property back, and that he was roughed up, but they couldn't go into that anymore. Then they went into the video of Ammon being tased, and came out with the names of quite a few, pretty much all of the people in those videos. They talked about, they wanted to point out a point in the video where Ammon kicked a dog in the head. And the agent on the stand says, well, yeah, he kicked the dog in the head, or Mike Carpenter had the dog attack the Ammon after he kicked the dog in the head. We watched the video 2 more times after that, and he recanted his statement. So once again, we're showing conflicting statements just in the room while he's there. So I thought that went really well. They also brought up the fact that, yes, the ICP increased assessment. The people were working on limited sleep to no sleep and limited food to no food during the day of April 12th.
And all they got was a taco truck.
A
Yes.
chocolate truck, yeah.
So are they
All
mad
that.
that the
Poor
Bundys
baby.
didn't feed them?
It would have been nicer. They would have got some Bundy beef.
Would have been happier.
They also brought up the fact that there was no attack on the compound prior to the April 12th. I guess there was a time when they believed that there was going to be an attack on the compound. They got some information, and that attack didn't happen, and it was brought into the fact that maybe their information that they were getting was bad information. That was also objected to, and it stopped right there.
Yeah.
We have Todd Engel come in, and he immediately asked, because we all love Todd, he comes in and says, was Dan Lubb your supervisor? Obviously, yes, he was. Was any of the officers hurt in this? No, nobody was ever hurt. Not in any of the times of when Ammon was being tased, when Dave, any of the times, not even on the 12th. They also brought up, was anyone tried to actually climb over the fence or get into the compound? No, that did not happen. They also pulled up the video of Ammon being tased, and they were able to circle an officer in that and state that he was holding a Colt AR-15 rifle. And this is prior to the 12th, so it's kind of showing their militarization much earlier than they are trying to let on. Let's see, anything you guys got?
They talked about the First Amendment areas, about when they were set up and who set them up, and if the First Amendment areas were, if the under the bridge was closed due to the First Amendment area, and he said no, so stating that they could be down there.
I think he said under the bridge was, but the people standing on I-15. I-15 was not part of the closure. So basically anyone standing on I-15 was not actually in the closure. And that anyone at the Bundy Ranch was not in the closure.
But the closure was 540,000 acres.
Todd made a comment about the camouflage, and he said the agent said the reason we wore them is we didn't want to affect the cattle. And so then Todd asked, well, did the contract cowboys wear camo? And he said no.
Yeah. And they also did not get hurt by the cattle. And they brought up that no one was hurt by the cattle. And then he began to bring up were cattle put down, euthanized during this operation? And yes, 2 bulls were euthanized. And he said, you know,
and was he aware of it? And he said, yes, I was aware of it.
And then he asked if there was other cattle being put down in the field. And then this was also objected upon.
Right.
And we didn't get to go much further into this, but you could tell that people were seeing where they were going with these things.
Yeah, that question had to be withdrawn. And then he said, were you aware being killed? And he said yes. Some euthanized, some killed. And then they started talking about the Park Service stack formation, whether it be in a defensive move or an offensive move. And they got into the...
that was objected upon as well.
But they got into when the stack formation, when you're trained in law enforcement, is it usually when you're going to issue a warrant or if you're going into a building? And how is that a defensive move? Because you're moving forward, you're not in a defensive mood. So that kind of shot the whole stack formation on us.
At the end of his, he also asked if any of the protesters, and you know, they're say protesters, and they stopped Todd and they said, this is not considered a protest. They stopped him in the courtroom from using the word protesters because they are not seeing us as protesters, and they're seeing us as unlawful something. They're not an unlawful crowd, anti-government crowd.
Yeah.
So you can't even say the word protesters. You have to say the crowd. Now, did the crowd ever throw anything on you from the southbound bridge? And they said no. And because he brought that up, the southbound bridge, a lot, and he said, you know, if I was trying to, with a gun, trying to like get a superior advance on you, would I use the northbound or the southbound bridge? And he said, well, you'd use the southbound bridge. So pretty much they're breaking down the entire narrative they have on the inside. And then they were also counting vehicles. Todd made a circle and he said, can you tell me how many vehicles are in that? He said about 37. He said, well, say you had 37 BLM agents, say most of those vehicles were BLMs, and you had 37, that would mean there was 37 AR-15s on that side alone. And then
all BLM officers are issued AR-15s.
Yes.
And then he added another circle which brought it up to 50. And our side, our cars in the circle was like 60. So, you know, they're saying that, oh, you guys had guns and you had more people. But if you like looked at it, the gun ratio was probably heavier on their side.
Absolutely.
And then they said the government never told anyone that they had to protest from the First Amendment area. that First Amendment area was just a suggestion.
For their safety.
But it was not appropriate for them to go to the compound and protest there. That was not that was not appropriate.
My favorite part of Todd's whole questioning is did you take an oath to the Constitution, which was immediately objected to and sustained.
What happened?
Todd asked, sir, have you taken an oath to the Constitution?
They objected.
They objected immediately. Argumentative. That's an argumentative
So
statement.
after that, he said, "So what you're saying is the First Amendment area is only set up for looks?" And he responded, "That's not what I said." But he was talking about his training, and they asked him if he ever, on a criminal, if they ever do any investigation to find out if they have criminal backgrounds, if they did that on the Bundys, and at one point he said no, and then later on another, I forget who it was, had asked him if they had done any investigations, and he had said yes. So
Yeah, he worked for the Secret Service as well as the BLM before he went to the BLM.
Then we had Jackson come up, and he asked if there was a general policy for protest for the BLM. And he said, no, there is no documentation of what was a lawful and unlawful protest. And he said, so does this mean you just kind of make up your mind case by case? I think that was objected to, and we had to move on. Then it was Agent Love your superior? That was again yes. Who was higher up than Agent Love? They did say that there was someone on the ground that was higher up than Agent Love that was there.
They didn't name him?
No, they did not name him. Then they talked about the April 11th, how they decided they were going to be done with operations. And they had a big argument over what done with operations meant. And the agent on the stand said, you know, he made it seem like they were still going to take the cattle in the cages, but they weren't going to round up any more cattle. And he said, as I quote, personally, I wanted to finish loading up the 377 trespassing cattle and remove them from the land. He said personally he wanted to, and I believe that goes to show that, you know, when law enforcement came and told them to back up, he personally didn't want to do it.
Exactly, absolutely. Yep.
And then Todd Leventhal came on at the very end and asked if the BLM put videos out to counter the videos that were put out by the Bundys, because the videos that were put out by the Bundys were put out and made to grab the heartstrings. Like some of the dead cattle were, you know, for animal rights activists, and some of the First Amendment ones are for anti-government extremists, and I'm just quoting.
Yeah.
And they said no, they did not put out any videos to try to counter that. Then they talked about a list of people, a running log, as he says, of people that they use undercover agents in many anti-government extremist groups that were adding names to this running log of people that were added to the threat assessment. So now they didn't really go in a lot to this. This was moved on real quickly. But from what it sounds like people's names that maybe thought of coming or weren't even coming, people's names that were put on this list from such organizations like 3% or Oath Keepers or anything like that. So it sounds like they did have undercover agents trying to grab information, but he wasn't the investigational agent, so he couldn't comment on that. And then he asked, what was your direct relationship with Dan Love? And was he your direct supervisor? Yes, and you know, do you follow his orders? Obviously. If you saw Dan Love do something illegal, would you file a report on it? And he said yes. And then he said, if you saw Dan Love do something unethical, would you report on it? And there was a silence for a while. And then he said, well, can you explain unethical? And, you know, they did a little something. And then he said, I'd like to think I would. And then he went to continue saying something else. And Myrie was like, objection. I can't remember what he objected to, but he wouldn't let whatever was going to get out of that guy's mouth out of his mouth. And then we took a break.
Wow.
So hopefully we'll go back in and find out what he was about to say.
Good reporting.
He said, I've been made aware I've been made aware of that. And that's when they stopped him. And I went like this.
We don't know what